I'm Alice McKenzie, and welcome to Must Reads Classics, a series of interviews with authors of books in the field of homiletics that have come to be known as classics in the field because of their enduring impact. It's sponsored by the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence at SMU. And today, our guest is Dr. Jana Childers. Dr. Childers is professor of homiletics and speech communication at San Francisco Theological Seminary at the University of Redlands. She is a Presbyterian minister, a popular conference speaker, and she has preached across a variety of venues. She's the author and editor of a number of books and articles on recovering women's voices in preaching and what preachers can learn from the arenas of theater and the performing arts and performance studies. You can find out more about her various books and articles by coming to our Perkins Center website. But today, I must say, Dr. Childers, you've written so much that it makes it very difficult to choose a classic. But today, we focus on her book published in 1998 by Abingdon Press, entitled Performing the Word, Preaching as Theater. So welcome, Dr. Childers.
Thank you, Alice.
Well, I have a question then to start us off, and that is, what started you off in impelling you to write this book?
Yes. Well, you can tell by the attitude behind the book that I had a little tiny bit of an axe to grind. I had benefited myself tremendously from the performance background that I brought to homiletics. I knew it could make a difference. And I was also part of a denomination that is known for being the frozen chosen and could use a little bit of thawing, a little bit of lubrication.
Right.
And so I set out to sort of defend the notion that it was okay to think of preaching in terms of performance. You know, in the old days, old-fashioned homiletics, they used to call this part of homiletics so the preacher's use of self, something, euphemistic like that. And I wanted to say, no, we can really consciously and out loud and together think about performance.
Right. Well, I noticed at the beginning of the book that you talked about how it's, once you get the sermon onto paper, the words, it becomes ink, and then it's tough to get it back to blood. So it seems like your purpose is to move from flat preaching to 3D preaching by using the performance analogy.
Right, that enlivenment that happens when we embody preaching. Of course, these days it's a little harder to talk about because right at the moment, so much preaching is online, the two-dimensional version. Right. But there is a tremendous advantage to that third dimension, to what can happen when we're also, at least from time to time, in space with each other. You know, we can approach and we can avoid, and we're breathing the same air. There's a lot of electricity in terms of making the delivery and the energy of the sermon livelier.
Right. Well, one of my favorite lines in the book, and whenever I quote it, I will attribute it to you, don't worry. But you say that a sermon manuscript that is read is not a sermon, it's devotional literature, which I just thought was, put your finger right on the pulse of that. So preachers in the 80s were introducing preaching to the art of storytelling, but now here you come and you want to connect or introduce preaching to some long lost relatives, one of which is theater. So you got some pushback for that, I guess. But
well, yes. So I knew from the beginning that choosing a word like performance and then talking brazenly about theater was going to get some pushback. And, I was young and reckless, and I thought it was a good thing to try. But actually, that is true. It's equally true that it came out of my experience of honoring the theater, of being part of theater programs where a kind of a purist understanding of art and of theater as art was pursued. So I had not a cheesy understanding of theater, not a ham-fisted or lapping up the spotlight type understanding of theater, but an artist's understanding of theater. And I was it's anxious for people to have a little sense of that. Right. I think it is helpful to think of theater and preaching as an art. It means that they're not propaganda. It means that they're not just schmaltz. It means that there's something bigger going on.
Right. And I love that you quote Richard Ward in that old French definition or old French origin of the word performance, par fournir, which is something through to its completion.
It's such a great way to talk about what performance actually means. The connotative meaning of performance is where we get into trouble. All the things that are associated with the words are problematic. But Richard's definition, the denotative meaning, is very helpful to remember. He and Chuck Bartow and I were about the only people in homiletics during the time that he was first writing and I was first writing that were interested, that were actively pursuing this part of preaching. Otherwise, mostly it was relegated in those days, in the 80s and 90s, to people that would give maybe one lecture in a semester on what they call delivery, or at least devote part of the work that they did in the introductory course to delivery. But because of Richard's work and Chuck Bartow's, I think there's more interest in this generation of homileticians, and I'm so glad for that.
Right, and just the notion that a theater audience is participatory.
Oh gosh, the other actor on the stage with you, really. Yeah, I mean, I know there's Kierkegaard's sketch of, God being the audience, and certainly that makes theological sense. It makes great theological sense. But in terms of the moment, the actual preaching moment, you're in a back and forth dialogue with another actor, like an actor on the stage.
Right. That's a beautiful way to think of it. So not only are you wanting to introduce preaching to its long lost cousin, or whatever, however you want to express it, theater, you also want preachers to get to know their related artists who are actors. And I just was talking to a prospective student. If you wonder if your work lives on, yes, I was just talking to a prospective student who's very interested in acting and preaching. And I said, well, I have just the book for you. So I'm sure you got pushback on that too, but what's some of the common ground between an actor and a preacher?
Yeah, I think it has to do with an ethos that is based in the body, obviously the embodiment part of things, sort of an overcoming of shame about the body, and a willingness to offer the body and the voice as a vehicle, and then to use the stuff of our lives. I mean, the old homiletics professors were not wrong to think of this as the preacher's use of self. Really, what we're doing is trying to say preachers bring themselves to a sermon in a similar way to actors using the stuff of their lives, their emotional and their what actors call their sense memories, muscle memories. You bring all of that, and if you dedicate it to the Holy Spirit, I think, and ask for help, there's every reason to believe that God will use that in the sermon. It's sort of the flip of the coin. It's sort of the opposite of the old understanding that preachers should only be plain conduits or empty vessels, or that we should all just get out of God's way. Try not to bring anything of ourselves. Right. It's the opposite of that.
And the only problem with getting out of the way is I don't have anywhere to go, really. so why not bring it? But the description that you give of honest performances, an actor would call something an honest performance when he or she is, I understand you mean that drawing deeply on our experiences and being fully present in the moment. Is that?
Yeah, that's lovely. It is that. And it's also a resonance with the other word that actors use is truthfulness. So I love that, because what that's about is a commitment to not distort, as far as we can control it, right? To not distort to the representation of our experience. To not exaggerate it, to not underplay it, but to hit that note in the middle where it rings true.
And really what happens when an actor gives themselves over to the play, right, or a preacher to the purpose for which they're speaking, and rather than being sort of egocentric, it's the opposite, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. So it may honor that that old commitment to being a plain conduit. It may honor that in spirit, because in the end, right, you are less your ego and more your full self.
I have an acting professor from SMU Meadows School of the Arts come to my classes now and then, and he says, Kevin Huffeditz, and he says that an actor is not somebody that gets up and pretends to be somebody she's not, but someone that gives themselves over fully to the objective of the play. And that's really what I got from your inspiring description of the similarities between actors and preachers, which is very rich and something I share with students. So I have a sense that this book is just as much or even more relevant now than it was in 1998. Do you get that feeling?
That's very kind, a sense of yours. I appreciate it. I think that there are things about it that I hope this next generation will seize and run forward with. But as opposed, of course, in any book, there are also things that you go back and tweak. But the heart of the book that has to do with bringing your voice and your body to the task, I think it can be useful going forward. I hope so.
Right. And especially in these times of high distractibility, even greater visual learning and scattered attention, for the preacher to be fully present, it seems like, is more important than ever.
Yeah, and more in demand, right? Congregations are not as happy anymore, are increasingly unhappy, or have been for decades unhappy with manuscripts that are merely read.
Right, exactly. Well, it seems like to me that all people want these days is the reality of our careful preparation and the appearance of total spontaneity.
Yeah.
So I mean, your book really does give a theological basis for, and in acting as well, basis for real presence in a sense.
It's lovely. It's a lovely link to the term real presence. I do think really lovely actors, really accomplished actors are able to bring a genuine, sincere, authentic life to what they do, even if they've said those words many times before.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. And those of you who have a copy of Performing the Word already, Preaching is Theater, pull it off the shelf and reacquaint you with its wisdom. And those of you who do not, immediately purchase it and acquaint yourself with its wisdom. And we want to thank you for not only being with us this afternoon, but also for your contribution to the field, specifically today as the author of this must-reads classic, Preaching as Theater, Performing the Word. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. McKenzie.